All right, friends, welcome to week 2 of our series called Multiply. The more I get out into the world and hear from people, the more I realize the gospel that we share is impacting and reaching people in all kinds of places. And so shout out to people in Iowa and Indiana and Florida, in Richmond, Augusta County, Virginia, who are worshiping with us, who are hearing the gospel. And that's thanks to your investment in this ministry, this online ministry and the podcast ministry. So friends, thank you for that. I want to start today with a confession. Is that all right? Yeah, okay, thank you. I am not confident in my ability to speak to strangers about Jesus. And I realize that surprises some of you because you say, oh, isn't that your job? Isn't that why we pay you, you know? But for those of you who are not surprised by that, thank you, because you recognize, like you, I'm a human being and I have strengths and weaknesses. And that's something that I'm not totally comfortable with. When I hear the word evangelism and think about what it has become in the church these days, I grimace a little bit because what I think of is the street corner preacher, you know, who stands on a milk crate and has a really bad sound system microphone and screams at people about heaven and hell. And I think, well, I don't really want to be that guy. I think of people who go door to door to the strangers' homes and knock on the door, and someone comes to the door and they say, "Can I talk to you about your salvation?" Right? And like right away, even Christians are like, I don't know if I want to have that conversation with you who I've never met. Anybody else have the kind of reservation about that way of sharing the gospel? Yeah, okay, so I'm not the only one. I appreciate that. Last week, Pastor Matt introduced this idea of multiplication, of reproducing the faith, and there are perhaps a precious few of us who, when he gave that message, you said, yes, this is awesome. Let me at it. Just tell me where to go. I'll tell everyone I see about Jesus. Probably the majority of us, our reaction was something more like duck your head and avoid eye contact and, pray that the next sermon series would come sooner than later, right? Because, I'm not sure about this idea of sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. One of the churches I served, we had a witness committee. And the job of the witness committee was supposed to lead the church in giving witness and telling people about Jesus. Honestly, most of what we did was have meetings where we talked about telling people about Jesus. You ever been in a committee like that? And one of the people on our committee, super nice guy, but I think every meeting, I'm pretty sure it was every meeting, he talked about the importance of us going downtown and handing out gospel tracts. Y'all know what gospel tracts are? Like little brochures, little slips of paper about this size, and they say things like salvation and heaven and hell and how do you get to heaven and who is Jesus. And it's the theory is if you would give someone this information and they would take it and read it and believe it, then they could be saved. And I don't know of very many people who think that's the best way to do it or who have been saved that way. But there are some people who they swear by this approach, and this guy was one of those people. And he would go on and on and on about it. And I could tell that no one else in the meeting really wanted to do it. You know, you can tell by people's body language. So when the guy started talking, immediately there was this discomfort that kind of swept across people, and they would shift in their seats. And he would go on and on. So one day we're in the meeting, and he's going on and on about it. And so finally, I just interrupted. And I said, hey, brother, I got to be honest. I don't know how to do this, what you're describing. I've never done it before. Teach us. How does it work? And what kind of success have you had with it? With, going downtown, handing out these brochures. What happened? And without even a hint of irony, he said, oh, I've never done it before. I just think we should. So, Lord help me. Oh. So he's going on and on about a particular style of spreading the gospel, how important it was, and he had never even tried it. Now, that was an eye-opening day for me as a leader, right? I learned something about human nature that day. But once I got over the frustration, kind of the shock of the moment, something occurred to me, as frustrating as this person was to me. Many Christians, including me, are just like that guy. We know what it takes to be a disciple of Jesus. We know that part of the deal is spreading the good news of Jesus. We've read this book, and we've seen that it commands us to do the work of evangelism, but we don't feel particularly good at it, and we may not be particularly committed to it, and we may not have a strategy. We may not even be sure how to start. Brothers and sisters, at the heart of the Christian faith is the idea of reproduction. Reproduction, right? Think about everything you know, biologically, spiritually, about reproduction. Okay, the story of our faith is reproduced in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. There is new life, and it spreads, right, from one person to the next to the next. It reproduces. Jesus started a movement with 12 people. And those 12 people reached 120, and those 120 reached 3,000, and on, and that is how the faith grew. Each one teach one. Each one teach one. This is the way the gospel spreads, by the power of the Holy Spirit and by the words and actions of a few willing men and women and children. This is how Jesus is reaching the whole world. Now, this is what Pastor Matt introduced to us last week. Lost people get saved. Saved people mature. Mature people multiply. It's really that simple. This is somewhat formulaic, but this is a way to boil down the character of the spread of the gospel, beginning in the scriptures and going forward through 2,000 years of the history of the church. Lost people get saved. Saved people mature. Mature people multiply. This is how Jesus started a movement. Jesus started a school. Did you know that? Now, we think of school, we think of the bricks and mortar, right? That's not what we mean. We mean a group. We mean a community of teachers and learners. Jesus started a school, which was a very ordinary thing for Jesus to do back then because all kinds of teachers and rabbis were doing this all the time. Jewish rabbis would go around and they would go to the Hebrew school and they would gather the best Hebrew students of each community and they would invite those Hebrew students who had memorized the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Can you imagine? No, me either, right? Some of us don't even have the first 5 books' names memorized, much less the first 5 books memorized. And so they would get these Hebrew students and they would train them in their school. Now, Jesus did the same thing, except instead of going to the Hebrew school, he went to the Sea of Galilee. And instead of getting Hebrew scholars, he recruited fishermen. And instead of teaching them in a classroom, he taught them out in the real world. And this is how Jesus is multiplying the faith. Now, there is an assumption, I think, that a lot of us have about education, that education happens in a classroom, right? Isn't that what we think? And that's sort of been trained in us because we live in the West. In the Western world, when we think about education, we think of a particular way of education. And that way is a teacher stands up front, and he or she gives some knowledge and information, and the students sit in rows, and you take notes, and you read books, right? You get a book, and the teacher says, okay, now read this chapter and read this chapter. And that is a fine way to do education, right? It works, right? We've done it for centuries, and that's a fine way to do it. Now, here's my question. Is that the only way to pursue education? Is that the best way to pursue education? We could argue about that, right? Okay. It's certainly not the only way. And it's certainly not the primary way that Jesus educated the people around him. Now, occasionally, Jesus would get up in front of a crowd and he would teach. So think about the Sermon on the Mount, right? Jesus got before the crowd and he taught. But that is sort of the exception rather than the rule. Most of the time, what Jesus did was not lecture, but leading. Jesus is leading. And so rather than standing up front and reading from the book or teaching, he's bringing people alongside him literally, and he's saying, hey, follow me, watch me. Okay, now you do what I do. Let me give you some feedback on what you're doing. Let's talk about it. Let's pray about it. Let's go from place to place and place and practice this way of living called discipleship. I think one of the reasons that we lack confidence in our work of evangelism, our work of spreading the good news of Jesus, is we assume that the training for that should have happened in a classroom. And you raise your hand and say, but excuse me, Pastor Brad, I haven't had evangelism class, right? Now, speaking for me, I have had evangelism class. It was not that helpful, okay? So I'm convinced this is much better. This is much better, okay? So I promise you, you're not missing anything. Jesus understood that learning and growth was much more than just mental cognition, right? When we think about education, we think about learning styles. Jesus is thinking about setting an example. He's thinking about training, about modeling, about partnering. Jesus wants to educate his students in holiness. He wants to grow them in holiness. He wants to grow them in emotional intelligence. He wants to grow them by planting the seed of God's word in their heart and allowing the truth to take root and to grow and to flourish. Okay, you see, friends, that does not happen primarily in a lecture. That happens primarily in life, when we are living like Jesus out in the world. So Jesus saved some people who were lost, and he raised them up in the faith, and then he sent them back out again. And it goes like this: lost people get saved, saved people mature, mature people multiply. Now, the way we put this at Timberlake is reach, feed, and release, right? Reach, feed, and release people to be the hands and feet of Jesus. This model for discipleship, for ministry, comes right out of the Scripture. This is how Jesus did it. So I want to read you a story about this because it's a great story, and I think it helps us get our head around this idea of evangelism and of discipleship. So we're going to read from Acts chapter 4. If you have your Bible, you can flip there. But let me do a little setup, a little background to the story. Where we are is in the early church. It's not very long after Jesus has been crucified and resurrected, and he has returned. He has ascended to sit at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. He promised the coming of the Holy Spirit. And so on Pentecost, he sends the Holy Spirit, and there's this power, this fire that comes among the people. Now they have courage, they have faith, they have boldness, which they need because at this time, in this place in the world, it is illegal to be a Christian. It is against the law, and you can be put in jail or worse if you are found to be one of the followers of Jesus. So the disciples need boldness, they need courage and faith to be able to engage the community in which they find themselves. So they are out doing exactly that, what Jesus commanded them. They're spreading the gospel. They're sharing the good news. They are healing people. They are blessing people. They are talking about the resurrection. They are sharing the love of Christ with their neighbors. And the religious leaders are trying to put a stop to it because they don't like it. They feel threatened. They don't like the idea of someone having more power than them. So here we are, Acts chapter 4. We're going to pick up the story in verse 1. We're going to read all the way through verse 13. While Peter and John were speaking to the people, the priests, the captain of the temple, and the Sadducees came to them, much annoyed because they were teaching the people and proclaiming that in Jesus there is the resurrection of the dead. So they arrested them and put them in custody until the next day, for it was already evening. But many of those who heard the word believed, and they numbered about 5,000. Now remember, we said about the growth, numerical growth. Jesus started with 12, and then there was 120 on the day of Pentecost. There were 3,000. Now the story says there's 5,000. Okay, so the number is growing. The faith is growing. The next day, their rulers, elders, and scribes assembled in Jerusalem with Annas the high priest, Caiaphas, John, and Alexander, and all who were of the high priestly family. When they had made the prisoners stand in their midst, they inquired, "By what power or by what name did you do this?" Then Peter, filled with the Holy Spirit, said to them, "Rulers of the people and elders, if we are questioned today because of a good deed done to someone who was sick and are asked how this man has been healed, let it be known to all of you and to all the people of Israel that this man is standing before you in good health by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead. This Jesus is the stone that was rejected by you, the builders. It has become the cornerstone. There is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among mortals by which we must be saved." Listen to this last verse. Now, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and realized that they were uneducated and ordinary men, they were amazed and recognized them as companions of Jesus. Okay, can you imagine the scene in your head, friends? Peter and John standing before the Sanhedrin. Do you remember who the Sanhedrin are? The religious ruling council. These are the guys that killed Jesus. What do you think it would mean to them to kill a couple of no-name followers of Jesus? No big deal, right? That is easy peasy, right, for these guys. So here are Peter and John standing before them, and they refuse to quit. They are not going to back down. They're asked, how did you do this? And the story says they were filled with the Holy Spirit, And then Peter gave the speech. Gentlemen, right? He's very respectful. Sirs, if you want to know how we did this, I will tell you. And by the way, let everyone else who is listening also know that the reason this man was healed was by the power of Jesus Christ, who, by the way, you murdered him, but God raised him from the dead. God raised him from the dead. And he, by the way, is the only one who can save you. Jesus, who you crucified, is the only one who can save you. And whether you think it's right or not for us to keep on preaching and healing and doing the ministry of Jesus, Peter said, you have to decide. Now, this is so bold. I love it. He said, you all decide. You do what you have to do. But just get it. We're not going to stop. We're not going to stop. You do what you have to do to us, but we are not going to stop. Look at verse 13 again. When they saw the boldness of Peter and John and realized they were uneducated and ordinary men, they were amazed and recognized them as companions of Jesus. They were uneducated and ordinary men. What does this tell you, friends? It tells you two things. This might be the most important verse in the whole story. It tells you two things. It tells you one thing about us, and it tells you one thing about God. Okay, so what does it tell you about us through the story of Peter and John? Well, it tells us they were just regular people, right? Peter and John are just like you and me. The men and women leading this movement were regular people. They did not go to seminary. They did not have the Bible memorized. They had no special qualifications. They were not getting paid to do this. The only reason they were doing this is because they believed a story. They believed a story about the resurrection of their Lord, and they believed it so deeply with all their life and all their heart that they were going to give themselves over to it, that it was going to be their whole mission in life is to spread the good news of that story and to tell people, look, I know this sounds amazing, but I knew the guy, and he loved me, and he taught me, and I saw him die, and I saw him raised from the dead. And I'm telling you, it's a true story, and it will change your life. They had experienced something so life-changing. They were committed to sharing it with other people. That's the first thing this verse tells you. Here's the second thing this verse tells you. Something about God, and that is that God can use anyone. God can use anyone, and God will use anyone and everyone. God is so big and so powerful and so creative and so merciful that God uses even a couple of dopes like Peter and John, right? Right. Now, think about what you know about Peter and John. Do you know a little bit of the backstory? Some of you do, some of you don't. That's okay. I'll fill in the gaps here and why this story is like so significant and why the religious rulers would have been amazed at this. John is the brother of James, and together they're the sons of Zebedee. But Jesus had a nickname for them. He called them Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Sons of Thunder. That sounds cool, right? I was on a basketball team in seminary called Sons of Thunder because we were super theological dorks, and we thought it was funny. But this was not a compliment from Jesus to them. Okay, why are they called Sons of Thunder? Well, because one day, Jesus and his disciples were going around ministering from town to town, and they came to this town that refused to give them an audience. The town was like, get out of here. We don't like you guys. We don't want to hear from you. And Jesus is like, okay, what should we do? And John comes up with this great idea. He's like, Jesus, I got it. We'll call down fire from heaven. We'll destroy them. All the people in the town, they'll all be crushed and judged right here on the spot because that's what they deserve. And Jesus is like, whoa, dude, calm down. No, we're not going to murder everybody in the town just because they won't listen to you, John. Okay, so that's John. Then there's Peter. You know the story of Peter? Jesus says to Peter, Peter, it's time for my crucifixion. You're going to deny me and desert me, and they're going to ask you, were you with me? And you're going to say no. And Peter's like, oh, that'll never happen. I'm with you, Lord. I'm committed. Well, sure enough, when push came to shove, Jesus was arrested, put on trial. He was crucified. People came to Peter and said, hey, aren't you one of his disciples? No, not me. Not me. And now, look at them. Now look at them. They are standing up for Jesus, standing up for the faith with boldness, with courage, and yet they are uneducated and ordinary men. Friends, God can and does use anyone and everyone. This is the power of the Spirit of God, even for Peter and John, even for you and for me, for all the people who God will call. Peter and John were regular guys, and yet they were leading a movement of God's people. Okay, what does that tell you? It tells you everything rises and falls on leadership. Everything rises and falls on leadership. I want you to think about every organization and family and business and country and school that you know. There is not an organization out there that thrives without capable leadership, right? There is not an organization that thrives without capable leadership. Let's put it in terms of real estate. You real estate people, you know this. What are the first 3 rules of real estate? Location, and location, right, which means you could have the nicest house, and if you put it in an unfavorable, undesirable location, it's not worth very much, right? And you could have the most modest little shack, but if you put it right on the beach, that's worth a lot, right? Okay, similarly, when it comes to spreading the gospel, the first 3 rules are leadership, and leadership. Friends, spreading the gospel depends on leaders, just as it does in your family and in your workplace and in this country. Have you noticed our country tends to go the way our leaders tend to go? Now, sometimes that's good, sometimes that's not good, right? Right, friends, everything rises and falls on leadership. Now, this is where you come in because you are one of the leaders God is calling into this mission. You are a leader. And you say to me, oh, who, me? Yes, you. You, friends. Here's how I know this. Because there's someone in your life who listens to you. Is that right? If it's right, nod your head. Some of you have hundreds of people who listen to you, right? And now some of you, maybe not as many, but at least 1 or 2. Someone listens to you. Every follower of Jesus is called to be a leader in this sense. And here's the definition of leadership. I'm going to put it up on the screen. Leadership is the influence God has given you with others. Leadership is the influence God has given you with others. Every single person listening to the sound of my voice is called by God to be a leader in this sense. Because you have influence with others in your life. We're talking about influence that God has given you to bless, to encourage, to pray for, to hold accountable, to lead others in the way of Jesus. And the pushback I hear from this is from people who say, well, Pastor, but that's not my gift. I don't have that particular gift. And it's true. The Bible testifies to a whole set of spiritual gifts that the believers are given. And some of us are given the gifts of helping, and some for healing, and some for wisdom, and some for miracles, and some for knowledge, and some for preaching. And it's true, every disciple has a gift. However, this work of sharing the gospel of Jesus is not to any one particular person. This is the work of every disciple, regardless of your gift. Your gifts are to be used for this work of discipleship, friends. Let me put it like this. Each one teach one. Say that with me. Ready? Each one teach one. Each one teach one. Imagine if every disciple of Jesus trained and raised up and mentored and ministered to another disciple of Jesus. Imagine the impact that the Church of Jesus could have on the world. If we all took responsibility for this, each one teach one. There's a history behind this saying in our country. Y'all know what it is? I learned it this week. I'd heard it before, but I did a little digging. This saying comes out of the African American community. And this saying came about when the literacy rate among enslaved people in this country was, as we might imagine, very low. And when a slave was taught to read and write, there was an expectation from that person's community on them that that person would then teach the next person to read and write. Each one teach one. You see, if you are given an extraordinary gift, you are expected then to share it and to use that gift to bless someone else. Brothers and sisters, if you have been given the gift of salvation in Jesus Christ, you are expected to use that gift to bless someone else. Each one teach one. Each one teach one. This is the essence of discipleship. Jesus taught a few people the way of the cross. And they taught a few others, and those taught a few others, and on, and the gospel spread around the world. Now, I know we're troubled by this, but the gospel didn't originate in the United States. You know that, right? It originated in the Middle East, and yet here it is. Now, how did it get here? You know, because God shoved a few Bibles out of an airplane flying over? No, because someone told someone who told someone. And the gospel has been shared to us, and now we are called to share it with others. I want to try to give you something to kind of get your head and your hands around this, a discipleship process. Some of you are sort of linear thinkers like me, and you're like, well, tell me, how does it look, okay? Here's how it looks, I think. The discipleship process. I do while you watch, and then we talk about it, right? And that's step one. And then step two is I do, and you help me, and then we talk about it. And then the next step is you do while I help you. And then we talk about it. And then the next step is you do while I watch. And then we talk about it. And then the last step is you do while someone else watches. Now, do you see this? Now, this is what we call apprenticeship. Any of you ever been an apprentice? Right? Isn't this kind of more or less how it goes? The apprentice is trained and is giving an increasing amount of responsibility and authority as he or she learns the craft over time. Friends, from the earliest days, the followers of Jesus were sent out into the world, and this is the way that they were taught to do it. This is the way. I'm going to talk to you about violins for a second. Any violin players here this morning? One. Any orchestra aficionados, people who like to listen to the orchestra play? Come on, let's have some culture here, people. Thank you. Gee whiz. Okay, orchestra aficionados and violin players. What is the most famous, most expensive, arguably the best kind of violin in the world? Stradivarius. Look, you are cultured people after all. The Stradivarius. Okay, so if you had your pick of cars, the best car in the world is what? Bentley, Porsche? A Chevy C110. My brother. Okay, yeah, you could argue. It's up for discussion, right? But violins, if you had your pick of the best violin in the world, you would almost surely pick a Stradivarius. Stradivarius is the gold standard. They were made in the late 17th and early 18th centuries by the Stradivari family in Italy, and they are rare. There's only about 650 of them in the world. They are expensive. They have sold at auction for millions and millions of dollars. They are esteemed for their high-quality sound and their craftsmanship. The one in this picture was made in 1687. It is owned by a private collector, and it was on loan for the photo, and for that time, it was on loan to the School of Music at Rice University in Texas. And I read an article about how this young lady, the graduate student, was selected as the first student from her program to be able to play it. In other words, this is a big deal. This is a big deal. Now, because these instruments are so incredible, many people have tried to reproduce them, right? If you were a violin maker and you knew Stradivarius was the best, you would try to make yours perhaps like the Stradivarius. And yet, even with chemistry and with advanced mathematics, even with modern technology, modern efforts to reproduce a Stradivarius fall pitifully short. No one can do it. It's really amazing that we are not able to reproduce, even with all of our modern advancements, what the Stradivari family turned out as a matter of routine about 300 years ago. Why are they so good? Why are they so good? Well, one of the reasons is the wood with which they are made. It's believed that the climate in the Italian Alps, where the trees were growing that were used with wood for these instruments, maple, willow, spruce, were grown in the perfect climate for making wood that turned out to be ideal for this kind of musical instrument. Now, you can search for this wood today. It's hard to find, but if you want to find it, what you have to do is you go to Italy. So imagine the scene, okay? Master and apprentice get on an airplane, and they fly to Italy. And they take a little car, and they go to one of the villages in the foothills of the Italian Alps. And they're going to go into the attic of these houses, which were built around the same time that the Stradivari family was using that same wood around there to build these violins. They're going to go into the attic to search for the same wood from that same era. Are you with me so far? Okay, so they go in the attic, and the master, he bends down, and he pries up a piece of wood, and he takes that wood and looks at it, and he balances on his fingertips. Then he knocks on the wood, and listens to it, and then he smells it. And then he licks his finger, and he runs it across the grain of the wood. And he shows us the apprentice. So you see this? You see this? This is good. This is excellent. This is $75 a linear foot. And we're going to put it in the keep pile. And we're going to go downstairs and we're going to buy it from this family so we can try to make the best violin. Okay? Then he bends down and pries up another piece of wood. And he looks at it and he balances on his fingers. And he knocks on it, listens. And then he smells it. And then he licks his finger and runs it across the grain. He says, this is trash. He puts it in the trash pile. And he does that a dozen times, and then he does it 24 times. And then, in the midst of this, maybe on the 6th house, they're looking through the wood, he picks one up and he hands it to the apprentice. And he says, now you try. And the apprentice balances on his fingertips and knocks on the wood and smells it and runs his finger along the grain. Okay, that is how this person is trained and taught to select the wood to make the best violin that they know how to make. Now imagine the difference between that method of apprenticeship versus if the master had said to the apprentice, here's a brochure on how to choose the right wood in 10 easy steps. Read this and get back to me. Two drastically different processes with drastically different results, right? You see, friends, this is how discipleship works. Each one teach one. We must come alongside one another to learn this. A lot of this is more caught than taught, as we say. So how about you, friends? Who is discipling you, and who are you discipling? Right? Because each of us is a leader, and each of us is a follower. Who is discipling you, and who are you discipling? And if you don't know the answer to that question right off the top of your head, then that's your homework for this week, to figure that out. And I'm serious. I really want you to think about this and figure it out. And if someone doesn't come to mind immediately, oh, yes, here's the person who is training me, ministering to me, pastoring me, showing me the way of Jesus. And by the way, when I say pastoring, I don't mean a pastor, right? I mean someone who is ministering to you. You should know who that person is. And likewise, there should be someone who is following you, who you are showing the way of Jesus. What I want you to do is I want you to commit those names to your memory and into your heart this week. And I want you to pray for those two people. And I want you to have a conversation with those two people. An intentional discipleship conversation. Say, yeah, Pastor Brad's making me do this thing, so I just want to let you know, you're my person. You know, I thought of you when he was talking. And I want you to know I want to have a relationship with you in this way so that together we might grow in our likeness of Jesus Christ. We might become all that God has called us to be. Friends, we need to practice being a student. We need to practice being a teacher. Here's what I know. Following Jesus is the hardest thing you will ever do. Following Jesus is the hardest thing that we will ever do. And so we need help, don't we? We need help, friends. We need companions for the road. We need partners for the journey. And so I'm inviting you to think about who that is for you this week. And I want you to think with me about the impact that we might have on this community and on this world. If we took this seriously, each one, teach one. If every Timberlake person took this seriously to reach one more person with the gospel of Jesus Christ. I did a little looking this week. Average Sunday worship participation in January for Timberlake Church between on-campus attendance and online participation, 971 people. Okay? So that's right, 971 people. Imagine if 971 of us took this seriously and said, yes, I'm going to commit myself to reach one more person. Now 971 more people are being blessed and being reached with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Friends, this is the mission. This is the call from Jesus himself. I'm telling you, it works. It works. It works with teaching people how to read. It works with teaching people how to split firewood. It works with teaching people how to do their taxes. It works with teaching people how to bake a cake. It certainly works with teaching people how to follow Jesus. Remember, not even Jesus tried to reach everyone, did he? Jesus reached 12. And those 12 reached some others, and those others reached some others until the gospel spread around the world. Each one teach one. Let's pray. Almighty God, if we're honest, Lord, we're scared by this idea of evangelism. We're not sure, Lord, that we want to go out and try to talk to strangers. So, Lord, we pray you would put people in our path. Put acquaintances and coworkers and family members and neighbors right in front of us so we don't have to go searching for them, but they would appear to us and that we might minister to them. We might love them and encourage them and pray for them and find ways to bless them in the name of your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ, that you would multiply, God, our efforts. You would multiply the work of this church and that we could continue to grow and pour out into all of the people of this community and all the people of this world. In Jesus' name, amen.